Good. Okay. Eric, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Eric Prendergast. I'm a senior archaeologist at Cardno and worked with Becky on this project. Funny enough, at the time from the Cardno side, and Becky was on the Florida Public Archaeology Network side. Now we work together at Cardno. But I'm the principal investigator on the project, and we'll be co-presenting.
Yeah, so this presentation is based on one that Eric and I put together for the Southeastern Archaeological Conference last year. I guess it seems like ages ago, but I guess that's how this year has gone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this project came to be, what have we found up to this point, and what are the directions that we hope that it's going in the future. So I should say that, as part of this presentation, we're not showing any pictures of human remains at any point in this presentation. Also, in this project, no human remains or burials were removed from the cemetery, and we took great pains not to disturb any human remains, and that was something that was really baked into this project from the very beginning and something we took very seriously. So like I said, there's no pictures of any human remains or anything like that, although we do have some pictures of objects that are associated with burials, just so everybody knows. So Zion Cemetery is in Tampa, Florida. Tampa, Florida, if you've ever been to Tampa, the way that Tampa kind of markets itself is this really diverse city. We have Ybor City, which is, a diverse immigrant kind of enclave cigar manufacturing community. That's kind of one of the main neighborhoods of Tampa. And that's really how Tampa likes to present itself to the world. But when we really start to look at the history of Tampa, what we see is much different. The kind of historical beginnings of Tampa go back to Fort Brooke, which was a Seminole War era fort that was a concentration camp that was used to displace Seminole people from their land and to remove them from Florida and send them to reservations in Oklahoma and places like that. So it's really not very surprising then that, the more that we look into the history of Zion Cemetery, the more we see those same sorts of processes play out, but with the African-American community in Tampa. So at every point in Zion's history, we see these systems that are working against this place to erase it from the map, to erase this sacred space from the landscape of Tampa. And we see that through things like segregation, taxation, annexation, all sorts of different mechanisms that were used to really try to destroy this place. But hopefully what you'll see through this presentation is that although on the surface, Zion looks much different than it did in the past, when we get beneath the surface, the resiliency of this place really shines through. And that's what we really want to focus on today. So, along those lines, on this page, you can see this is a picture of a Sanborn fire insurance map. These are really great maps if you're doing historical research. And one thing that's really cool is as these maps get updated, this is a physical book that you can see here, but you can also find them online. Every year that they get updated, instead of sending a new page for the book, this fire insurance company, they would send pieces of paper that had the updated buildings and things like that. And so the librarian would actually have to go in and paste that piece of paper onto the page to update the book. And so this page, you can see here, this is 1950s, showing the area of where we now know that Zion Cemetery was located. But on this map, these pieces of paper are covering up the cemetery that's beneath it, both kind of like metaphorically and actually. These updates are literally pasted on top of the cemetery. And that's what we found in the reality of this space too, is that these more modern landscapes are really pasted on top of this historic cemetery, which is Zion Cemetery. And we can start to peel back those layers so that we can get back to what it once was. So Zion Cemetery, it's one of Tampa's earliest African-American cemeteries. You can see it's located here on Florida Avenue, north of downtown, in the kind of Tampa Heights area of Tampa. That's right there. So the way that this story all kind of got started is because of this man, Ray Reed. He's a cemetery historian. He hates to be called that, but that is truly what he is. And just a genuinely wonderful person. And Ray has, for a very long time, been researching another cemetery in Tampa, which is an indigent cemetery that's in another part of town. So he's been researching, looking through literally every death certificate, historical death certificate, looking for names of people who were buried in this cemetery. But during this process, Ray started to come across these death certificates that had the name of a cemetery that he had never heard of before, Zion Cemetery. And there's a reason he had never heard of it before, because for all intents and purposes, it didn't exist. There was no Zion Cemetery in the city of Tampa. So what could all these death certificates, where are these people buried? Where is Zion Cemetery? What is this place? So through a series of kind of serendipitous events, which happened a lot on this project, Ray got in contact with Paul Guzzo, who is a reporter for the Tampa Bay Times. You can see him there on the left. And Paul was interviewing him about another story, but Ray was like, okay, this is all great and all, I'll talk to you about this, but the real story is, where is Zion Cemetery? What happened to it? And at first, Paul was really reticent to take on the story because, how do you lose a cemetery? Is that even possible? Like, how is he going to report on this? But thankfully, his partner and coworker, James Borchuk, who you can see on the right, convinced Paul to take on this story and to really delve in and to see what happened and to figure out where Zion was located. So Paul's first stop was, of course, the Tampa Bay History Center. They have an amazing historic map collection, which now a lot of them are digitized and online. So if you are interested in, researching any spot in Florida, I would suggest going there first because, like I said, they have this wealth of historic maps that are all digitized and online that you can check out. So Rodney Kite Powell of the History Center, he finds this plat map for Zion Cemetery that's from 1901. And the map shows a potter's field up in the northeast corner. There are 98 family plots that are all 20 by 20 feet. And the cemetery covers about 2.5 acres. But, where is this place? We have this map, but where does this sit on the landscape? So Paul reached out to the office of the state archaeologist up in Tallahassee, looking for some help, and they told him that he should contact his local office of the Florida Public Archaeology Network. So FPAN, where I very recently stopped working only a couple of weeks ago. We have offices all across the state of Florida for just this sort of purpose, to help with these sorts of situations. So he reached out to our office in Tampa, and I started taking a look at some of the maps and getting them into the kind of computer to try to figure out where this place was located. And when we overlay the plat map based on the description that you see on there, we can see that the place where this plat goes, there's no cemetery that currently looks like it's there. And in fact, the cemetery, it falls across 3 different property owners: the Tampa Housing Authority, which you can see here. This is the Robles Park Apartments. Richard Gonsmart, who, if you've ever been to Tampa, you've probably gone to the Columbia restaurant. So his family, he is the owner of the kind of Columbia restaurant group. And then another property owner who owns a tow lot that's up in here. There's a small portion of it there too. And then we also have, obviously, roads and things like that that would fall to City of Tampa and that kind of a thing. So, with this in mind, Paul's next thought is, okay, well, obviously all the people there had to have been moved, because we have all these buildings that are on top of this property. How can I figure out, where these people were moved to, or kind of what happened? And then that obviously led to a lot more kind of historical research into this neighborhood and how this property kind of changed hands over time. So what you can see here is this blue area right here. This was the historic Robles Pond neighborhood, which was an African-American neighborhood that up until the 1920s was actually outside of the boundaries of the city of Tampa. It was, an important Black community. There was a school. This is a picture of the school from 1927. There were multiple churches, lots of homes, many people who lived in this area, for many, many years. So you can't really talk about the story of how Zion came to be without kind of talking about the history of segregation in our country. So in 1896, we have the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court decision that really codifies into law segregation and makes segregation the law of the land in this country. So if we look at the other cemeteries in Tampa, cemeteries that go back to like the 1850s and 60s, those cemeteries are internally segregated, right? We have, but we have, different sections within that cemetery where people of different races and religions are buried within the same cemetery. So at Oaklawn, we have one section that's for white Protestants, another area that's for African Americans, another area that's for Catholics, and that sort of a thing. But as we get into the late 1800s, going into the 1900s, that's when we see this this shift to cemeteries that are completely segregated. So we have all white cemeteries, and then cemeteries that are only for Black people, and that's kind of what Zion was, founded during this kind of shift. So the city of Tampa is not, there's no cemeteries that will serve the Black community. So the Black community has to create cemeteries to serve their people and to have a resting place for people to be buried. And that's why, in 1894, Richard Doby, who was a prominent African-American businessman, purchased 2.5 acres of land from a white homesteader, Isaac Warner, for $110 in order to set up a cemetery to serve the Black community of Robles Pond and of the city of Tampa, and that was Zion Cemetery. I love this advertisement. This is an advertisement from a newspaper in the Tampa Times in 1915, and it shows C.W. Patterson. He was an undertaker who buried many of the people who are buried at Zion Cemetery. He was also on the board of a coffin and furniture making company called Florida Industrial and Commercial, who purchased Zion Cemetery from Richard Dobie in 1907 for $300. So, you know, he's definitely an important figure in the history of the cemetery too. And it's so great that we have a picture of him, because he's really one of the only people who's actually associated with the cemetery that we have a picture of at this point. Almost from the beginning of when this cemetery was established, though, we start to see these attempts to take this cemetery, to take this land from the Black community. So J.J. Head, who you can see here, he was a Confederate veteran. He was also the tax collector for Hillsborough County. And one of the things that he did was go around, because he's the tax collector, go around and buy up the tax deeds on properties that were delinquent in their taxes. And so in 1903, he actually tried to purchase the tax deed on Zion Cemetery, even though it's a cemetery and therefore doesn't, you know, shouldn't be taxed for any property taxes. Fast forward to 1912, this goes to court. J.J. Head claims in court that he should, you know, own a part of the property for the cemetery because he bought up this delinquent tax deed. And at first, he wins the suit. And the judge says that he's not aware that there was even a cemetery there at all, and that J.J. Head should get this property. So we don't know what happened after this. People were still being buried at the cemetery, but it's unclear what kind of happened with the ownership after this point. But during this time, we start to see some changes to how the cemetery is represented in the map. So this one from 1916, you can see this is the normal footprint of the cemetery as we saw on the plat. Fast forward to the 1920s, and the front part of the cemetery is missing. That front's on Florida Avenue. So there's some changes in ownership, or, you know, what's happening with the cemetery between these times. You can see that on this Sanborn map too. So this portion of the cemetery that fronts on Florida Avenue is now a separate parcel that's separate from the cemetery, when before this would have all been cemetery. And this kind of coincides with another big change that happened, which was in 1923. This Robles Pond neighborhood in Zion Cemetery get actually annexed into the city of Tampa. So this would have increased the level of taxes that property owners would have faced, and it, you know, also brought it within the city and within, you know, the kind of governance of the city of Tampa. So the real, you know, end to the cemetery as it was kind of came in 1926. Somehow, Alice Fuller, who is the descendant of Isaac Warner, who was the original white property owner who sold to Richard Dobie, gets possession of the cemetery property and sells it for $1 to a Tampa developer who is H.P. Kennedy. And H.P. Kennedy, he buys the cemetery. He applies to have all the taxes on the property kind of expunged because, you know, he goes in front of the city council and This is a cemetery, so I shouldn't have to pay any taxes. And then a few months later, he applies for a building permit, and he builds these shops that you see right here along Florida Avenue on what was and what is Zion Cemetery. And that's really the last that we see of the cemetery in any maps or documents until Paul's reporting all those years later. And we can see that kind of reflected too. And these are the number of burials per year from the death certificates that we've been able to find. As we get into 1919 and into the early 20s, we see the number of burials really drop off. So, you know, part of that might be because the cemetery was full, or it could be because of some other issues with the ownership or whatever was going on. Eric, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, so I guess we fast forward a little bit to the 1950s. Many people on this Zoom call are familiar. The period of the 1940s and 50s was the beginning of the public housing boom in the United States that often led to the destruction of existing minority communities, often Black, across cities in the United States, and Tampa was no different. And the area of Robles Pond that Becky's just been talking about, of course, was an African-American community, which was targeted for slum clearance during that time. And that was in 1950, the HUD put up the funds for the creation of Robles Park Village, the 5th housing development in the city of Tampa. And it was to be an all-white housing development. At the time, the residents of Robles Pond resisted considerably. We see in the minutes of the Housing Authority from early 1950s, residents coming forward and lodging formal complaints and refusing to sell. Of course, their land was going to be taken by eminent domain, and this was back when eminent domain had teeth. You could take land, or at least the government could, or public utilities or other projects of shared public good. And it got so far that the residents were able to get the Tampa NAACP to go to the main office in DC and get firepower, representation to come down and try and stop the Housing Authority. But basically, to make a long story short, for time, the battle was lost and Robles Park Village was built. And I guess, can I move forward, Becky? During the construction, this is one of the first times in the history of during you might say Zion's dormancy that coffins were found in a very official manner. During the digging of this wall trench that you see these guys reaching their hands into in this picture, they found 3 infant-sized coffins, very shallow, some 16 inches deep, 15 inches deep. And of course, this is one of those moments where you see how the establishment actually suppresses the official memory of a place, because of course the workers went to the police said, well, let's check with the city, and when they did, the city told them, no, the bodies have been moved. We should beg the question, what are they doing here if they had been moved? But that was enough for the Housing Authority. The Housing Authority moved forward and built the entire housing development despite the discovery of these 3 coffins. I think one more slide. And so today, these buildings remain. They are the oldest housing stock in the city of Tampa. Of course, the Housing Authority has presently has plans to renew the property even before any of this happened, even before any of the Zion Cemetery story started to develop. But now the only thing that's different is they are not whites only, of course, because we're past legal segregation. They are predominantly African American inhabited. So we have this situation that's felt very strongly on the ground of the residents living at Robles Park Village, where there's an African American community living inside of buildings built on top of stolen graves of their ancestors in a space that was intended to exclude them, the descendants. So that's the way people feel that live there. Fast forward again.
So in June of 2019, Paul feels like he has enough information that he can publish this story. And talking to Paul about this, the night before this story was published was probably the most stress that he's ever felt about any story. Because, what if, you write the story, it's published, it's on the front page of the paper, and then someone comes out and is like, oh, that cemetery was actually somewhere else, or I have all these documents that show it was already moved and everything was done respectfully. So, it's very stressful for him, but he had all the information, and the Times ran with it, and it was on the front page of the paper. It was probably one of the most read stories for the Times in 2019. And, it made a lot of news. So when the story was published, someone did come forward, and that's Mrs. Unive Massey. She's 96 years old, and she grew up in a house in the 1930s that backed up onto Zion Cemetery. And luckily for Paul, she also has probably the best memory of any person alive today. Paul said that she could remember box scores from baseball games in the 1940s. And so she had an amazing memory. She has an amazing memory. But what Mrs. Massey remembered about the cemetery was that, one day in the 1930s, when she was a little girl, these men came in these big trucks with equipment, and they started to dig up graves from the cemetery that was in her backyard. And how they did it was not in a careful or respectful way. Some of the graves were left open overnight and over the weekend. She remembers little kids from the neighborhood running through the cemetery and jumping down in the graves and taking things out of the burials, that there were bones that were scattered all on the surface. And so that, that's not obviously a respectful way to treat a sacred place like this cemetery. But then it begs the question, were people moved from the cemetery, even if it wasn't done in a respectful way? And if so, where were they moved to? Because, we haven't found any documents to show that anyone was moved really somewhere else. So with all this information, like Eric said, the Tampa Housing Authority has very different leadership today than it did in the 1950s. And Mr. Jerome Ryans and Leroy Moore, once this story came out and they became aware of it, really jumped into action to try to figure this out and to do what they could to make this right. And thankfully for this whole process, one of the things that the Tampa Housing Authority excels at the most is bringing people together, building consensus, and consulting with community. And so that's exactly what Mr. Moore and Mr. Ryans did, is they started the Zion Cemetery Archaeological Committee, which brought together staff from the Housing Authority, tenants and tenant leadership from Robles Park Village, apartments, local community leaders, the representative from the Hillsborough NAACP, archaeologists like Eric and I, staff from the city of Tampa, all different sorts of people together to try to come together to figure out how to start to figure out this problem and what to do and how to move forward. So one of the first things that, so Cardinal was already working for the Tampa Housing Authority, and so THA brought Cardinal in to be the lead consultant on the archaeology that was to be done there to figure this out. So one of the first things that Eric and Cardinal proposed to do was a whole lot of GPR. And all the areas that you see here in yellow and orange were areas kind of in the first stage that we did GPR testing to try to see, do any burials still exist for the cemetery, and what are the boundaries, the potential boundaries of this cemetery. So Tampa is a really small archaeology town. So Cardinal, they teamed up with our FPAN office, and we have a GPR unit at our office that we brought out to also help with the testing that was done. And what we found with the GPR were graves, were burials of the people who were buried in Zion Cemetery. This is some of the results from our initial GPR survey. This is at a depth of about 140 centimeters beneath the surface. This is an open area between two apartment buildings, and this GPR grid is right up next to the building. These rectangular objects that you see here, they're oriented east-west, they're rectangular. These are the coffins, the intact burials of the people who were buried in the cemetery and who have been there, probably for definitely for more than 100 years. Since that initial phase, we've done even more GPR. Cardinal also had really fancy, it's called Stream C GPR, that was great on doing the roadways. You can see we even brought it down Florida Avenue to check to make sure that there are no burials there. And all these red rectangles that you see here are burials that are from this cemetery. And so, that was another big story that kind of came out. But what was most important is that this isn't just some piece of property that's out in the woods somewhere. People are actually living on top of this cemetery. It's one thing if you choose to live next to a cemetery, like it's, there's a fence between your house or it's across the road, but no person who's living in Robles chose to live on a cemetery. And so the first priority was, once we knew that there are graves that were there on the property, was to move the residents who were living in the buildings that were on top of the cemetery. And because of the hard work of THA and Riva Iman, who's the president of the Tenants Council, and Clark Simmons, who's the vice president, and all the THA staff, they were able to relocate the residents who were affected to the housing of their choice in much better situation in a very quick amount of time, which was, to me, the best part of all this is that they got to get out of that bad situation. And, as we were doing this work, once the residents moved out from those buildings, we were still interacting with the community. We're out there doing GPR, so we're talking to the kids as they're getting off the bus. We're talking to residents about what we're finding. THA plans many different resident engagement events. So Eric and I and others, we were able to come out and talk about what we were finding so far to keep people informed. And that was all really important to this project. But so these things that were done to Zion were horrible things, and it's easy to try to, to think about this story as something that's terrible, but really it's the thing that makes Zion what it is are the people who are buried there, and their stories are a beautiful story and an inspiring story. And the more that we learn about the history of this place, the more that we can bring those stories forward, and then, empower community members to bring those stories forward, so that, we can learn from them, that everyone in the city of Tampa can learn from them, and we can learn about the stories of these Black pioneers who made Tampa what it is today. And so, we can learn that from their death certificates, from their obituaries. There's some of those that we've been able to find. From their death certificates, we can get a sense of the population who were in Zion. So there was, a huge amount of infants, stillborn infants, and babies under 1 year old who were buried in Zion. But the oldest person who was more than 85 years old. So, we have a big range in age of the people buried there. There's also a lot of diversity in the places where people came from. Many of the people were from Florida or Tampa, but we also had people who came from the Bahamas and the West Indies, or even, other parts of the South or other parts of the country. So the kind of, the next phase that we embarked on over this past year was this ground truthing portion. So Eric, I'll turn it over to you. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. There's a picture of the hydraulic excavator that we use to conduct this stage of the work. Actually, and there's Becky and I looking at an artifact. I'm going to guess that we didn't know what it was at the time. So what we did was target 3 different areas, and the process of delineation and ground truthing is to first find the edges of the cemetery physically, beyond just ground penetrating radar. I saw a question pop up earlier a little bit. I'm sure we'll touch on it later. Does ground penetrating radar disturb bodies? No, it just bounces a radar signal off of the coffin, presumably, but we don't actually know. And in fact, ground penetrating radar makes mistakes all the time, or in fact can't find objects that might actually be there. Sometimes utilities or other things that are dangerous. So we have to physically look for the edges of the cemetery, and that's the first step. The second thing that we want to do is confirm that the images that are returned from ground penetrating radar are actually coffins, intact coffins and human burials. We can do that in a really controlled way that doesn't disturb the human remains or burial, really the coffin. But it just, that's the method that we'll get to. And number three, the third goal is to look for areas where bodies have been removed. That's very important because we know from other cemeteries and lots of other archaeological work that's been done, when bodies are removed, a lot of times what results is a disturbed field of human remains that's suspended in the soil. And that can be a terrible, that's something that we need to deal with to manage the property and to make sure that it's not further disturbed. We can secure that. So those are our goals. In order to approach those, we chose these 3 areas to excavate, 1, 2, and 3. We'll come back to this map once to orient you to the excavation as we go along. First, we'll start in Operation 2. So this is Operation 2. We use a hydraulic excavator to carefully remove down to about 2 inches of soil at one time. You can see that in this photograph here. And in fact, this was the first project where we decided to take Becky's, I say Becky's, but the GPR anomalies and spray paint them onto the grass. So you can see in this photograph the location of where we believe graves are at the beginning of our excavation. And we will open up this area in this photograph until we start to see grave shafts, which I will explain in a moment. Here we are from space, or really just from a drone. This is a courtesy of the Tampa Bay Times. And you can see Operation 2 as we opened it up. And, you know, this is sort of like the cooking show where they put the, you know, the unbaked biscuits in the oven and then they pull out like the perfectly baked biscuits. This took a long time to do, but you're just seeing the end result. We carefully removed all of that soil. And I think even from this altitude, you can probably make out these darker rectangular shapes. And we'll zoom in a little bit in the next slide. There they are again. Those are grave shafts. A grave shaft is not a result of the coffin itself, but of the hole that is dug to place the coffin in the ground. When you dig the hole and remove sediment, you are going to disturb different colors of sediment that are below your feet in a layer cake, light, dark, or whatever the case may be. And when you remove those soils, it creates an intermixture of those soils, a discoloration, as we would say. And when you push that back in, it leaves an impression in the soil that's not unmistakable. That is a grave shaft. It's 7 feet long and 2 feet wide. And here we exposed carefully the first 2 rows of grave shafts on the easternmost extent of the cemetery. And I think in the next photograph, you can see our goal there was to clear 30 feet east of those graves to prove that there are no further graves, so we can say definitively that we know the edge of the cemetery. And I think we were pretty successful here in this Operation 2 of doing that. Then you'll see there's a hole that's an excavation unit. Deborah, this one looks pretty good, but not all of our walls were straight. This one was one of our most decent attempts.
Yeah, you don't want to see what my walls look like.
I can't take credit for this one. I'm known to crush walls, especially when I'm supposed to be in charge. So what we're doing in this case is excavating down to look for the remains of the coffin, not necessarily the human remains within the coffin. And we did eventually find at the probably around 4 feet relative depth below the relative ground surface, the lid of that coffin. Of course, there's no lid. It's deteriorated wood that leaves what we call a coffin stain that you can find in the sand, and you know pretty much. And then once you have coffin hardware, which we'll show in the next photograph, you pretty much know what you have. What's fascinating about this coffin hardware is these are thumb screws. They're very ornate. You would purchase these out of a coffin catalog between about 1880 and 1920. What we're seeing is the remnants of a professionally made, professionally manufactured coffin that also had a viewing pane, something I won't get into, but a piece of glass through which you can see your loved one as they're being interred or or lying in state. What was surprising about this is that this is what we thought was the Potter's Field. Potter's Field is a place for indigent burial. That is, people who for some reason couldn't afford to their family, or they have no family and they can't afford to finance a burial, the city will pay to bury you in a potter's field. Well, that's what we thought. It turns out, and I might also say, as archaeologists, we thought that we would maybe have an idea of what would be in a potter's field. We thought, oh, well, this is going to be indigent burials, maybe shroud burials, or at least maybe provisional coffins that are not like formal coffins. We were wrong. There are formal coffins in this area. Either we're wrong about the nature of the potter's field, that it is actually became a place for more formalized burial, or of our expectations about what an indigent burial might be were wrong. But this is a place where there are formal coffins and formal burials, just like anywhere else in the cemetery. So we'll go now to Operation 1 and kind of skip ahead a little bit. We did the same thing. And here, what we found was an example of a type of archaeological deposit that was all over the cemetery. And that is special grave offerings that were placed with the deceased by their loved ones. And we'll find in an African-American context, in the Southeast or otherwise, there are certain items that have a spiritual or other significance that are associated with interment. And Becky can elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. So there are many, different kind of ethnographic, historical, anthropological studies that have looked at burial practices at African American cemeteries, especially during this kind of time during the, kind of ending in the early 1900s of different burial practices and offerings left within or on top of graves in African American cemeteries. One of the most common that still you can see in, if you've ever been to an African American cemetery in the South, especially if you're in kind of like coastal Georgia, or a cemetery that has a kind of Bahamian influence, is you will see shells that are left on the graves. Sometimes these shells are even impressed into the concrete of the headstone, or the whole kind of mound of the grave is covered in clamshells and something like that. And that's because shells have a lot of significance, not just in the kind of Christian faith, where they have these associations with pilgrimage and water and death. And we see the shell symbols on headstones in all kinds of Christian cemeteries. But shells also have this deeper connection to African traditions and religious practices that come from the central west coast of Africa, from the Congo and the kind of Yoruba peoples of the central west coast of Africa. And so shells have, they're obviously connected to water, and in the belief system, the religious belief system of those peoples, that the afterlife, the underworld, is watery. The ancestors, when you die, you pass through or over this kind of watery world to get to the land of the ancestors. So when you leave a shell on a grave, it's a token that kind of acknowledges that passage, and also kind of offers safe passage for that loved one to go to the land of the ancestors, to go back to, into the afterlife. The other sorts of objects that we see are sometimes objects that were the last thing that person touched in their life. So it could be just look like an everyday cup or plate or bowl, could be a spoon or a medicine bottle that individual took that medicine right before they passed away. Other objects that we see are things like vases or ornate pitchers. Those are objects that hold water, which, like I said, has that connection to this this view of the afterlife as a kind of watery world. In one of the burials in this operation, in this southeast portion of the cemetery, we found this milk glass vase with very beautiful, ornate kind of floral edge to it, and several shells that were together within the grave shaft of this one grave. So on many of the graves that we found some kind of grave offering or object that fit into one of these categories that are very specific to African-American cemeteries of this time period. And I should just say that if this is a subject that you're interested in, this is a great book. It's called Afro-American Tradition and Decorative Arts. And there's a whole chapter that's on African-American cemeteries and grave decorations, and it's really great. So. Oh, you're on mute, Eric.
Thank you. I can't figure out Zoom. I'm not equipped for this world. In Operation 3, you'll see that it marked on this map. That's the last area that we'll talk about here. The purpose of that of that test area is related to the former location of Univ Massey's house at 214 Nordica. Remember, she was the woman that Paul Guzzo found, who Becky just said had the most incredible memory. She remembered everything. And we assumed that from the place that she stood at that house, based on some of our GPR results, that Operation 3 would be the most likely place that she might have seen burials being removed. There, the GPR anomalies appeared disrupted, not just from roots, but maybe from something else. It looked pretty strange. So here is the beginning of that operation. So I'll also say from the kind of like digging perspective, at this point in the excavation, Becky and I and everyone we were with were kind of looking at each other and thinking like, oh God, like what did we do? Because we couldn't, it was so disturbed. We couldn't figure out what was going on. There were lenses of different colored soil going every which way. And that's a really disturbing thing to see when you're steadily digging down and you know there's human graves around. You want to have some clarity. You want to have, so eventually in the next picture, we'll see, we decided to just go for it and kind of go down and clear out. Eventually the soil turned to a homogeneous color, and what we saw was this, which was a head scratcher. All these shafts look different than the other grave shafts that we saw in the rest of the cemetery. They are larger, they have amorphous edges, and they're filled with a much darker fill. So we immediately thought that these were certainly anomalous grave shafts, and we decided to test them to see what would, basically with the thought that these might be the remnants of the removed graves. And here is the test unit that we placed on one of those largest, darker anomalous grave shafts from that last image. And this is the level that we would expect to arrive at the coffin, or really the base of the coffin. And instead, what we found in this particular burial were a pile of these remarkable queen conch shells and coffin hardware. And there you can also see a cockle shell and some ornate glass. We know from what Becky just explained, that's indicative of water-bearing vessels that have significance with the interment of the dead and the commemoration of the dead. But no bones and no coffin, which is, I have not experienced in digging cemeteries. Usually if you happen on a ghost burial, as we might call them, there's just nothing. but you're not going to find this pile of interred items, but then the shaft is devoid of any coffin remains. This is a place that a burial was removed. This is the archaeological evidence of a removed grave from the 1930s. The workmen or women dug down to this depth, removed the burial, and tossed back in the and I would check myself on the verb choice there. I don't know if that they were tossed back in or that those workers recognized the significance of those items and placed them back into the grave shaft where they maybe thought that they belonged. We don't really know, but they were redeposited. And very significantly, on the next slide, you'll see a better picture of one of these queen conch. We happen to have had with us Ryan Harkey, who a lot of people on the call probably know, who is an archaeomalacologist, someone who specializes in the study of archaeological shell. And Ryan knew that we were outside of the native range of queen conch. They're not a shell that you're going to readily collect in Tampa Bay. They are, however, in the Bahamas. And as we saw on one slide that Becky discussed, there are, Becky, 11 Bahamian or West Indian burials at Zion or something like that?
I think there are 19 maybe they themselves were from the Bahamas or the West Indies, but then there were additional people who their mother or father were from. So
yeah, and anyone that's from Tampa or has spent any amount of time here, you know that the African American community has West Indian roots in Tampa, and so those are all probably related to the endemic origin of this shell that somebody might have picked up in the Bahamas and taken to Tampa to bury with their loved one, which is just so striking and remarkable and gives you a real sense of the heritage and culture of the place. And basically all of this evidence, as Becky and I have and other people working on the project have talked about it and tried to write about it, it drives home to us the point that Zion is actually a landscape of resilience. When we talk about Zion as an erased space, we're doing a little bit of a disservice to the memory that people carried for those decades that the establishment denied its existence. And when we call Zion a lost place, these are well-meaning terms, we give people a place where they can kind of comfortably sink back into some old racist tropes, where they can sort of blame the community itself for the loss of their own space. The fact is that these things might be true of what is above the surface, the above ground remnants of Zion, the tombstones, the fences, the signs were wiped away and they were replaced by buildings. But below ground, Zion is a vibrant cultural landscape of African American material culture. And so it's still here, and the archaeology and artifacts bear that out.
Mm-hmm. So, Zion it's still here, and what it helped to do is to kind of kick open the door for other cemeteries that are also still here, but are not visible on the surface within the city of Tampa, but also in other parts of Tampa Bay. So if you would have looked at a map of cemeteries in Tampa in 2018, it would have looked something like this. The red squares that you see were the cemeteries. But today, if you looked at a map of cemeteries in the city of Tampa, there were several more that we can now add back to the map. Zion, Ridgewood Cemetery, College Hill Cemetery, Port Tampa Cemetery. Across the bay, we have 2 cemeteries that are in Clearwater, cemeteries in St. Petersburg, And Zion was really the kind of catalyst, so the community has always known about these places, members of the community, of the Black community of Tampa. But what Zion kind of helped to do was to make it so that their stories are now believed, so that white people in Tampa now believe, like, oh yeah, this is possible, and we need to look into this, and this is something that's important. And that's the change. Not that now people are suddenly remembering these places, but now that their memories are respected and believed, and something's actually done about them. And this whole project has, there's just so many connections to what we see happening today, because the systems that led to the erasure of Zion Cemetery are the same systems that in many ways are still working today against the Black community of Tampa, against the historic Black spaces of Tampa. And our colleague Fred Hearns, he's a historian, and he's now working on his PhD at USF in anthropology. He was quoted in the paper as saying, "But you can't hide the truth. It will be dug up. And those young people out in the street inherited our rage. Until we tell the whole truth, there will always be a lingering evil waiting to pop up its head." And so these cemeteries are a way that we can expose these anti-Black and racist systems that were working in the past and are still working today. And so if we learn about this history, then we can confront its legacies today, and we can hopefully heal as a community and move forward for that. And I know that's the hope of all of us who have been working on this project, is that this project can be one way that we can kind of reveal this true history of Tampa and other communities throughout our country. And moving into the future, now plans are starting to be underway to plan for a memorial that will hopefully bring back all the properties together to create a memorial, where Zion Cemetery is located, so that community members can come together. This can be a sacred place, once again, where people can come together to remember those who are buried there, to celebrate their lives, and to also celebrate the history of these Black pioneers who made Tampa what it is today. So thank you all so much. We're happy to answer any questions that you have, and we appreciate you being here to listen.